The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Ravensholm Palace as Prince Alexander stood in the marble corridor, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The ornate chandeliers cast dancing shadows on the walls, but nothing could illuminate the darkness that had settled over the royal family in recent weeks. His wife, Princess Elena, had been growing increasingly distant, and he knew exactly who was behind it. Lady Victoria Ashford had arrived at court 6 months ago as the new private secretary to the Queen Mother, but Alexander could see through her polished exterior. She was ambitious, calculating, and, worst of all, she had somehow managed to poison his stepmother's mind against Elena. The Queen Mother, Isabella, had always been protective of the royal traditions, but lately her criticism of Elena had become particularly harsh and personal. Alexander's footsteps echoed through the empty hallway as he made his way toward the Queen Mother's private chambers. He had requested this meeting 3 times through proper channels, but Isabella had refused each time. Tonight, he would not be denied. The future of his marriage and the stability of the crown itself hung in the balance. Elena had been crying again when he left their chambers. She tried to hide it, but Alexander knew his wife too well. The constant scrutiny, the whispered criticisms, and the deliberate exclusions from important royal functions were taking their toll. Elena had come into this marriage with such hope and determination to serve the kingdom, but Lady Victoria's influence over Isabella was systematically destroying that dream. The guards at Isabella's door stepped aside as Alexander approached. They knew better than to question a prince's authority, especially when his jaw was set with such determination. Alexander knocked once, then entered without waiting for permission. Isabella sat by the fireplace, her silver hair perfectly styled even at this late hour, while Lady Victoria stood nearby with a stack of papers in her hands. "Alexander," Isabella said coolly, not looking up from her book. "This is highly irregular. You should have made an appointment." "I tried," Alexander replied, his voice steady but firm. "3 times. We need to talk, and we need to talk now." Lady Victoria moved to speak, but Alexander held up his hand. "Alone," he added, his eyes fixed on the woman who had been systematically undermining his wife. "This concerns family matters." "Lady Victoria is my trusted advisor," Isabella replied. "She may stay." "No, she may not." Alexander's voice carried the authority of someone who would one day be king. "What I have to say concerns the future of this monarchy, and I will not say it in front of someone whose loyalties are questionable at best." The tension in the room was palpable. Lady Victoria's face flushed slightly, but she maintained her composure. Isabella finally looked up from her book, her piercing blue eyes studying her stepson's face. After a long moment, she nodded almost imperceptibly. "Victoria, please give us some privacy," she said quietly. Lady Victoria gathered her papers, her movements sharp and efficient. As she passed Alexander, she paused for just a moment, and he caught the flash of something dangerous in her eyes. This woman was not going to give up her influence easily. Once they were alone, Alexander moved closer to the fireplace, the warmth doing nothing to ease the chill that had settled over the royal family. Isabella closed her book and placed it on the small table beside her chair. "You're upset about Elena," she said simply. "I'm upset about the treatment Elena has been receiving," Alexander corrected. "She's my wife, the future queen consort, and she's being treated like an outsider in her own home." Isabella's expression remained neutral. "Elena must learn to adapt to our ways. The monarchy has survived for over 1,000 years because we maintain our standards." "Our standards?" Alexander's voice rose slightly. "Is excluding her from the charity gala planning committee maintaining standards? Is having her publicly corrected for minor protocol infractions that half the court makes regularly maintaining standards? Is spreading rumors about her background and questioning her suitability maintaining standards?" For the first time, Isabella looked genuinely surprised. "I don't know what you're referring to." "Then, perhaps you should pay closer attention to what your trusted advisor has been doing in your name." Alexander sat down across from his stepmother, leaning forward intently. "Elena came to this marriage with nothing but love for this family and determination to serve the crown. She's learned our language, our customs, our history. She's worked tirelessly to prove herself worthy of the position she never asked for but accepted out of duty." Isabella was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "She's different from us, Alexander. Her background, her family. Her family may not have titles, but they have honor," Alexander interrupted. "Her father is a respected professor, her mother a dedicated teacher. They raised a daughter with intelligence, compassion, and integrity. What more could we ask for in a future queen? The people expect certain things from their royalty. The people love her, Alexander said firmly. Every public appearance, every charitable event, every time she speaks with citizens, they respond to her warmth and sincerity. The only place she's not welcomed is here, in her own home, by the very people who should be supporting her. Isabella stood and walked to the window, looking out at the rain-soaked gardens. Perhaps I have been overly concerned with tradition. It's not just about tradition, Alexander said, rising to follow her. It's about deliberate sabotage. Lady Victoria has been feeding you information designed to make Elena look incompetent and unsuitable. She's been arranging situations where Elena is set up to fail, then reporting those failures back to you as evidence of her unsuitability. That's a serious accusation. It's the truth. Alexander's voice was heavy with emotion. I've watched it happen, Isabella. Elena is questioned about protocols that don't exist, criticized for decisions that were made by committee, and blamed for miscommunications that were created deliberately. And every time, Lady Victoria is there to document the mistake and report it back to you. Isabella turned from the window, her face troubled. Why would Victoria do such a thing? Because she wants Elena gone, Alexander said simply. She wants the position and influence that comes with being close to the future king's wife. But she can't have that as long as Elena is here and thriving. The Queen Mother walked slowly back to her chair, her movements showing every one of her 73 years. If what you're saying is true, it is true, Alexander said gently, sitting back down. And it's tearing this family apart. Elena barely sleeps anymore. She's lost weight, stopped laughing, stopped believing in herself. The woman I married is disappearing, and I won't stand by and watch it happen. Isabella was quiet for several minutes, the only sound in the room the crackling of the fire and the rain against the windows. Finally, she spoke. What do you want me to do? I want you to see Elena for who she really is, Alexander said. I want you to look past the reports and the carefully arranged incidents and see the woman who gets up at 5 in the morning to read briefings about every person she'll meet that day. See the woman who spent her own money to fund an entire wing of the children's hospital because she couldn't bear to wait for the bureaucracy to approve the funding. See the woman who learns the names and stories of every staff member in the palace because she believes they deserve to be seen as people, not just servants. I had no idea she funded the hospital wing herself. Because she didn't want credit for it, Alexander said. She just wanted those children to have better care. That's who my wife is, Isabella. That's who you've been turning away. Isabella nodded slowly, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I may have made some errors in judgment. We all have, Alexander said gently. But it's not too late to fix this. Elena still believes in this family, still wants to serve the crown. But she needs to know that she's wanted here, that she has support from the family she married into. And Lady Victoria? Alexander's expression hardened. Lady Victoria needs to be reassigned to a position where she cannot do any more damage. Her behavior has been manipulative and destructive, and it ends now. Isabella stood again, this time with more purpose. I'll speak with Elena tomorrow, and I'll review Lady Victoria's position immediately. Thank you, Alexander said, rising as well. That's all I wanted. A chance for Elena to be judged fairly, on her own merits, without interference. As Alexander prepared to leave, Isabella called out to him. Alexander, I hope you can forgive an old woman's stubbornness. He turned back with a small smile. There's nothing to forgive. We're family. But, as he walked back through the corridors toward his chambers, Alexander knew the real battle was just beginning. Lady Victoria would not accept this defeat quietly, and there were others at court who benefited from the current instability. The conversation with Isabella was just the first step in a much larger fight for the soul of the monarchy. When he entered their bedroom, Elena was sitting by the window, still in her evening gown but with her shoes kicked off and her hair falling loosely around her shoulders. She looked up as he entered, hope and fear warring in her dark eyes. How did it go? She asked softly. Alexander sat beside her and took her hands in his. It's going to get better, he promised. We're going to fix this, together. For the first time in weeks, Elena smiled a real smile, and Alexander felt something loosen in his chest. They had a long way to go, but tonight was the beginning of fighting back. The next morning brought an unusual quiet to Ravensholm Palace. Elena woke before dawn, as had become her habit, but instead of the familiar knot of dread in her stomach, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months, cautious hope. Alexander had already left for his morning ride, but he had left a single white rose on her pillow with a note that simply read, "Today is a new beginning." As Elena prepared for her daily briefings, her lady-in-waiting, Sarah, entered with an unusual spring in her step. Sarah had been one of the few staff members who had remained consistently loyal to Elena, and the strain of the past months had been evident in her increasingly worried demeanor. "Your Highness," Sarah said, setting down the morning tea service. "The Queen Mother has requested a private breakfast with you this morning. Just the two of you, in her personal dining room." Elena's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her teacup. "Did she say what it was regarding?" "No, ma'am, but—" Sarah hesitated, then continued with a small smile. "The kitchen staff say she specifically requested your favorite pastries. The almond croissants from the French bakery in town." It was a small detail, but Elena recognized it as significant. Isabella never paid attention to such personal preferences unless she was making an effort to be welcoming. Perhaps Alexander's conversation had truly made a difference. An hour later, Elena stood outside the Queen Mother's private dining room, wearing a simple but elegant navy dress that Alexander had always said brought out her eyes. She knocked softly and entered when bid. Isabella was already seated at the small round table, dressed impeccably as always, but there was something different about her demeanor. The usual cold formality was replaced by something that almost resembled nervousness. "Elena, dear," Isabella said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "Please sit. I've taken the liberty of ordering breakfast for us." As they settled into their seats, Elena noticed immediately that Lady Victoria was nowhere to be seen. Typically, she would have been hovering nearby with her ever-present notebook and barely concealed disapproval. Her absence felt like the lifting of a dark cloud. "I owe you an apology," Isabella began without preamble, her direct approach catching Elena off guard. "I have been unfair to you, and, more importantly, I have been blind to the way others have been treating you in my name." Elena set down her coffee cup carefully, not trusting herself to speak immediately. This was not what she had expected. "I spoke with Alexander last night," Isabella continued, "and he opened my eyes to some very disturbing truths. I had allowed myself to be influenced by reports and observations that, upon reflection, paint a picture that doesn't match the woman I see before me now." "Your Majesty," Elena began softly, "I know I have made mistakes. I'm still learning." "You have made no mistakes that any of us didn't make in our first years here," Isabella interrupted gently. "The difference is that your mistakes have been magnified and reported while your successes have been ignored or minimized. That ends today." Elena felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. "I only want to serve the crown and support Alexander. I never wanted to cause division in the family." "You haven't caused anything," Isabella said firmly. "You've been the victim of a campaign designed to undermine your confidence and your position here. I should have seen it sooner, and I should have protected you better." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both processing the weight of the conversation. Then, Isabella reached into her handbag and withdrew a small velvet box. "This belonged to Alexander's mother," she said, opening the box to reveal an exquisite sapphire and diamond bracelet. "She wore it on her wedding day, and to every important state function afterward. I had always planned to give it to Alexander's wife, but I let my doubts cloud my judgment." Elena stared at the bracelet, overwhelmed by the gesture. "Your Majesty, I don't know what to say. Say you'll accept it, and accept my apology along with it." Isabella's voice was warm in a way Elena had never heard before. "And, please, when we're alone like this, call me Isabella. Your family." As Isabella fastened the bracelet around Elena's wrist, Elena finally allowed herself to hope that the nightmare of the past months might truly be ending. "Thank you, Isabella. This means more to me than you could know." "There's something else we need to discuss," Isabella said, returning to her breakfast. "Lady Victoria's position here will be changing. I'm reassigning her to the archives department, where her attention to detail will be valuable, but where she'll have no contact with family matters." Elena nodded, though she felt a flutter of concern. "She won't be happy about that." "No, she won't," Isabella agreed. "Which is why we need to be prepared for some pushback. Victoria has cultivated relationships with several members of the court, and she may try to use those relationships to maintain her influence." "What kind of pushback?" Isabella's expression grew serious. "There may be attempts to create new controversies or to resurrect old ones. There might be leaks to the press or attempts to make you look bad in public situations. We need to be vigilant and prepared." Elena felt some of her newfound confidence waver. I'm not sure I know how to fight that kind of battle. You won't be fighting alone, Isabella assured her. Alexander and I will be standing with you, and we'll make sure the rest of the family understands the new dynamic. But, Elena, I need you to promise me something. Of course. Promise me you won't let them change who you are, Isabella said earnestly. Your compassion, your genuine care for people, your ability to connect with everyone from heads of state to kitchen staff. These aren't weaknesses to be corrected. They're strengths that this monarchy desperately needs. Elena felt a warmth spread through her chest that she hadn't experienced since her early days at the palace. I promise. As they finished their breakfast, Isabella shared stories of her own early struggles with royal life. And, for the first time, Elena felt like she was talking to a family member rather than a stern judge of her every action. When they parted ways, Isabella took Elena's hands in hers. We have work to do to repair the damage that's been done, she said. But I want you to know that from this moment forward, you have my full support. Anyone who has a problem with you will have to answer to me. Elena left the breakfast feeling lighter than she had in months, but she also knew that Isabella was right about the challenges ahead. As she walked through the palace corridors, she could feel the curious glances of staff members who had undoubtedly heard whispers of the previous night's confrontation between Alexander and Isabella. When she reached her office, she found Alexander waiting for her, along with her private secretary, James, and her press liaison, Margaret. The three of them looked up as she entered, and Alexander immediately noticed the bracelet on her wrist. I see the breakfast went well, he said with a smile, rising to kiss her cheek. Better than well, Elena replied, unable to keep the smile from her face. But Isabella warned me that there might be some retaliation from Lady Victoria and her allies. Which is why we're here, Margaret said, opening her tablet. We need to develop a strategy for handling whatever comes next. If there are going to be attempts to undermine you publicly, we need to be ready with a coordinated response. James nodded in agreement. We should also consider proactively scheduling some high-profile engagements that will showcase your strengths. Remind people why they fell in love with you in the first place. The Children's Hospital opening is next week, Margaret suggested. And the Veterans Charity Dinner is the week after. Both events where you naturally shine. Alexander sat on the edge of Elena's desk, taking her hand. What do you think? Are you ready to start fighting back? Elena looked around at the faces of the people who had remained loyal to her through the darkest period of her royal life. She thought of Isabella's words about not letting them change who she was, and she felt a surge of determination she hadn't experienced in months. Yes, she said firmly. I'm ready. But even as they began planning their strategy, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that Lady Victoria's retaliation would be swift and more vicious than any of them anticipated. The woman had spent months carefully building a network of influence and information, and she wouldn't give it up without a fight. That afternoon, as Elena was reviewing briefings for her upcoming engagements, Sarah burst into her office with an expression of barely controlled panic. Your Highness, she said breathlessly, you need to see the afternoon papers. There's a story. Elena's heart sank as Sarah handed her the newspaper. The headline read, Palace Insider, Future Queen's Secret Financial Scandals Revealed. Below it was a photo of Elena from a recent charity event, but the caption suggested connections to improper financial dealings that Elena knew were completely fabricated. As she read the article, Elena realized that Lady Victoria had indeed begun her retaliation, and it was going to be even more ruthless than anyone had predicted. The war for Elena's place in the royal family was far from over. It was just beginning. The war room, as Alexander had come to think of the small conference room adjacent to his office, buzzed with activity as the crisis management team assembled. News of the scandalous newspaper article had spread through the palace like wildfire, and by mid-afternoon, 3 more publications had picked up variations of the story. Each iteration grew more salacious than the last, painting Elena as everything from a gold digger to a money launderer. Elena sat at the head of the table, her composure remarkable given the circumstances, but Alexander could see the tension in the set of her shoulders and the way she gripped her pen just a little too tightly. Isabella had joined them, her fury barely contained as she read through each article with growing disgust. This is character assassination, Isabella declared, throwing down the latest tabloid. These aren't even coherent accusations. They're throwing mud at the wall to see what sticks. Margaret, the press liaison, had been working the phone since the story broke. I've traced the source, she announced as she rejoined the group. The initial leak came from someone with access to Elena's financial records from before her marriage. Someone who would have had legitimate reasons to review that information. Lady Victoria, Alexander said grimly. It wasn't a question. Almost certainly, though she's been clever about covering her tracks. The information was leaked through intermediaries, and by the time it reached the press, it had been distorted beyond recognition. James, Elena's private secretary, spread out a timeline he had been working on. If we look at the pattern of Elena's supposed financial irregularities, they all center around her charitable donations and family support payments from the past 3 years. Everything she did was completely legal and transparent, but the way it's being presented makes it look suspicious. Explain, Isabella commanded. For instance, James pointed to one section of the timeline. Elena made a significant donation to the Children's Hospital Foundation 6 months before it was announced that she would be patron of the charity. The article suggests this was some kind of pay-for-play arrangement to secure the patronage. That's ridiculous. Elena spoke for the first time since the meeting began. I donated to that charity because I believed in their work, not because I wanted to be patron. The patronage was offered later, after I was already married. We know that, Margaret said gently. But the way it's being presented, the timeline suggests corruption. Alexander studied the articles spread across the table. What about the family support allegations? They're claiming Elena has been funneling palace funds to her family's business ventures, James explained. In reality, she's been helping her parents pay off their mortgage and supporting her sister through university. All with her own money, all completely documented and legal. But they're making it sound like she's been embezzling from the crown, Isabella said, shaking her head. This is beyond malicious. This is criminal. Can we sue? Alexander asked. Margaret grimaced. We could try, but that would mean a prolonged legal battle that keeps the story in the news for months. And proving malicious intent would be difficult since they've been careful to present everything as questions rather than direct accusations. Elena finally looked up from the papers she had been reading. There's something else. Something I haven't told any of you. The room fell silent as everyone turned their attention to her. Alexander reached for her hand, concerned by the gravity in her voice. 3 weeks ago, Lady Victoria approached me privately, Elena continued. She suggested that I might be happier if I stepped back from some of my royal duties. She said there were concerns about my suitability, and that it might be better for everyone if I took a lower profile. She what? Isabella's voice was dangerously quiet. She made it sound like it was friendly advice, like she was trying to help me avoid embarrassment. But now I realize it was a warning. She was telling me what would happen if I didn't voluntarily remove myself from the picture. Alexander felt a cold rage building in his chest. Why didn't you tell me? Because I thought I could handle it, Elena said softly. And because I was afraid you would do exactly what you did last night, confront Isabella and potentially make things worse. Elena, Alexander said gently, you should never have to handle something like that alone. I know that now, she replied. But, at the time, I thought if I just worked harder, proved myself more thoroughly, the problems would resolve themselves. Isabella stood abruptly and began pacing the length of the small room. This has gone far beyond personnel issues or policy differences. This is a coordinated attack on the stability of the monarchy itself. How so? Margaret asked. Think about it, Isabella explained. If these accusations stick, Elena's position becomes untenable. She would either have to step back dramatically or potentially even leave the family entirely. That would create a constitutional crisis around the line of succession and severely damage the crown's reputation. James looked up from his notes. You think Lady Victoria is working with outside interests? I think Lady Victoria is more dangerous than any of us realized, Isabella replied. And I think we've been playing defense when we should be playing offense. Alexander leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. What do you mean? I mean it's time to investigate Lady Victoria as thoroughly as she's been investigating Elena, Isabella said firmly. If she's been manipulating financial records and leaking confidential information, she's committed serious crimes. We need to find evidence of that and present it to the authorities. The palace security team could handle a discreet investigation, Margaret suggested. They have the clearance and the expertise. Do it, Alexander commanded. But carefully. We can't afford to have this look like a vendetta. Elena had been quiet during this exchange, but now she looked up with a determined expression. There's something else we need to consider. If we're going to fight back, we need to do it publicly as well as privately. What do you mean? Alexander asked. I mean I need to stop hiding, Elena said firmly. I've been so focused on not making waves that I've let other people control the narrative about who I am. If I'm going to be accused of financial impropriety, then I need to be completely transparent about my finances. If I'm going to be accused of using my position for personal gain, then I need to show exactly how I've been using my position to help others. Isabella stopped pacing and looked at Elena with something approaching admiration. You want to go on the offensive? I want to tell my story before anyone else can tell it for me, Elena clarified. I want to invite journalists to review my financial records. I want to showcase the work I've been doing with charities. I want people to see exactly who I am instead of who my enemies claim I am. Margaret was already taking notes. It's risky. Full transparency means exposing yourself to even more scrutiny. More scrutiny than false accusations of corruption? Elena asked. I'd rather be judged on the truth than on lies. Alexander felt a surge of pride watching his wife transform from the uncertain, defensive woman she had become over the past months into the strong, determined person he had fallen in love with. If that's what you want to do, we'll support you completely. We'll need to be strategic about it, James warned. Full transparency has to include everything, not just the parts that make you look good. I understand, Elena replied. I'm not afraid of the truth. As the team began planning their counteroffensive, Alexander noticed a change in the room's energy. For the first time in months, they weren't just reacting to attacks, they were taking control of the situation. But he also knew that Lady Victoria wouldn't take this escalation lying down. If Elena was prepared to go to war publicly, then the stakes were about to get much higher. There's one more thing, Isabella said as the meeting began to wind down. I'll be making some changes to the staff structure, effective immediately. Lady Victoria will be escorted from the palace this evening, and her access to all royal family information will be terminated. Won't that look like retaliation? Margaret asked. At this point, I don't care how it looks, Isabella replied. She's proven herself to be a security risk and a threat to family unity. Her position here is no longer tenable. As the team dispersed to begin implementing their plans, Alexander pulled Elena aside. Are you sure about this? Once we start down this path, there's no going back. Elena looked at him with clear, determined eyes. I'm sure. I'm tired of being afraid, and I'm tired of letting other people define who I am. If we're going to save our marriage and our future, we need to fight for it. Then, we fight, Alexander agreed, pulling her into his arms. But we fight together, and we fight smart. As they stood there in the empty war room, surrounded by the evidence of the attacks against them, both Elena and Alexander knew that the coming days would determine not just Elena's place in the royal family, but the future direction of the monarchy itself. The battle lines were drawn, and there would be no quarter given on either side. The morning of Elena's press conference dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight streaming through the tall windows of the palace's blue drawing room. Elena stood before the ornate mirror in her private chambers, adjusting the sapphire bracelet Isabella had given her. The weight of it on her wrist had become a source of comfort over the past week, a tangible reminder that she was no longer fighting alone. In the 3 days since the team had decided on their strategy, the palace had become a hive of controlled activity. Financial auditors had worked around the clock to prepare comprehensive documentation of Elena's personal finances. The press office had carefully selected journalists known for their integrity and thoroughness. Most importantly, the palace security team had made some disturbing discoveries about Lady Victoria's activities that would change everything. Alexander entered their chambers carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. James just finished the final review of your statement, he said, handing her a cup. And Isabella wanted me to tell you that she's incredibly proud of your courage. Has there been any word from the investigation into Lady Victoria? Elena asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. That's what I wanted to talk to you about, Alexander said, his expression growing serious. They found more than we expected. Much more. Elena sat down in the chair by the window, sensing from his tone that this conversation would be significant. Tell me. Lady Victoria has been documenting private family conversations and financial information for over a year, Alexander began. But she wasn't just collecting information for her own purposes. She was reporting to someone outside the palace. Who? Marcus Thornfield. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. Marcus Thornfield was a media mogul known for his sensationalist publications and his particular interest in damaging stories about the royal family. He had been responsible for several previous scandals that had rocked the monarchy. So this was never really about me personally, Elena said quietly. I was just convenient. You were a target because you're new and vulnerable, Alexander corrected gently. But, yes, This appears to be part of a larger effort to destabilize the royal family. Lady Victoria was being paid handsomely for inside information. Elena set down her coffee cup, her hands shaking slightly. How much of our private life has been compromised? The security team is still going through everything, but it appears she had access to financial records, personal correspondence, and detailed reports of family meetings and private conversations. Alexander's jaw tightened with anger. She even recorded some conversations without consent. That's illegal. Very illegal. The authorities have been notified, and Lady Victoria was arrested this morning on charges of theft, breach of privacy, and conspiracy. Thornfield is being investigated as well. Elena felt a complex mix of relief and violation. Knowing that the attacks against her had been financially motivated rather than personal somehow made them easier to bear, but the extent of the privacy breach was deeply unsettling. Does this change our strategy for today? She asked. Only in that we now have concrete evidence of the conspiracy against you, Alexander replied. James has prepared an additional statement that you can choose to include or not, depending on how comfortable you feel. A knock at the door interrupted them. Sarah entered with a bouquet of white roses and a small card. These just arrived for you, Your Highness. Elena opened the card and smiled for the first time that morning. It was from the Children's Hospital staff, wishing her luck and thanking her for her continued support. Attached was a drawing from one of the young patients showing Elena as a superhero flying over the palace. They believe in you, Alexander said, reading over her shoulder. The people who actually know you, who've worked with you, who've benefited from your kindness, they all believe in you. I hope that's enough, Elena murmured. It will be, Alexander assured her, taking her hands. Because today, you're going to show everyone else who you really are. An hour later, Elena stood at the podium in the blue drawing room, facing a carefully selected group of journalists. The room was filled with television cameras and recording equipment, and Elena knew that her words would be broadcast around the world within minutes. Alexander sat in the front row, his presence steadying her, while Isabella watched from the side of the room with an expression of fierce pride. Good morning, Elena began, her voice clear and strong. I've called this press conference to address the recent allegations about my financial conduct and to provide you with complete transparency about my personal finances and charitable activities. She had rehearsed these words dozens of times, but now, speaking them in front of the assembled media, they felt powerful and liberating. I want to begin by acknowledging that these allegations have been extremely painful for my family and me, she continued. Not because they threaten my reputation, but because they suggest that I would abuse the trust that the people of this kingdom have placed in me. Elena gestured to the thick folders of documents that had been prepared for each journalist. In these packets, you will find complete documentation of every financial transaction I have made since joining the royal family. You will find records of every donation I have made to charity, every gift I have given to family members, and every expenditure I have made using my personal funds. She paused, letting the significance of this transparency sink in. You will also find documentation of the sources of those personal funds, including income from book royalties, inherited assets, and the allowance provided to me by the Crown for my official duties. A journalist in the second row raised her hand. Your Highness, are you concerned that this level of transparency might set a precedent that future royal family members would be expected to follow? I hope it does, Elena replied without hesitation. I believe that public service requires public accountability, and I would be honored if my example encouraged greater financial transparency throughout the institution. Another journalist stood. What do you say to critics who suggest that your charitable donations were calculated to improve your public image? Elena smiled slightly. I would say that every donation I have made was motivated by a genuine belief in the work being done by these organizations. The timing of my donations was based on when I learned about needs or when I had funds available to help, not on any public relations strategy. She gestured toward the back of the room, where several representatives from her supported charities were seated. I've invited some of the people who work with these organizations to be here today so that you can speak with them directly about our collaborations. As the questions continued, Elena felt her confidence growing. Each inquiry gave her the opportunity to explain not just what she had done, but why she had done it. When asked about supporting her family financially, she spoke eloquently about the values of loyalty and responsibility that had been instilled in her from childhood. My parents sacrificed their own financial security to ensure that I had the education and opportunities that prepared me for this role, she explained. When I became financially able to ease their burden, I considered it both a privilege and a duty. Near the end of the formal question period, Elena made the decision to include the additional statement James had prepared about Lady Victoria's activities. Before I conclude, she said, I want to address how the false information about my finances came to be published. Yesterday, the palace security team concluded an investigation into the unauthorized access and distribution of private royal family information. The room grew noticeably quieter as journalists sensed a significant development. We have discovered evidence that a former palace employee was paid to collect and leak confidential information about royal family finances and private activities, Elena continued. This individual has been arrested and charged with multiple criminal offenses. She looked directly into the television cameras. I want to be clear that while these criminal activities explain how false information about me was generated and distributed, they do not excuse my failure to be more proactive in sharing accurate information about my work and my values. Elena concluded her statement with a personal reflection that she had written herself, without input from speechwriters or advisors. I came into this family with nothing but love for my husband and a deep desire to serve the crown and the people of this kingdom. I have made mistakes, and I will undoubtedly make more. But I promise you that everything I do in my role as a member of this royal family will be guided by integrity, transparency, and genuine care for others. As she stepped away from the podium, Elena felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. Alexander was the first to reach her, wrapping her in a fierce embrace. You were magnificent, he whispered in her ear. Isabella approached them, tears glistening in her eyes. That, she said firmly, was exactly what this monarchy needed. You may have just saved us all. But, even as Elena basked in the relief and pride of having finally told her story on her own terms, she knew that the real test would be in how the public responded. The battle for her place in the royal family was far from over. But, for the first time in months, she felt like she was fighting from a position of strength rather than defense. The war room would reconvene that evening to assess the initial public reaction. But, for now, Elena allowed herself to feel something she had almost forgotten. 2 weeks after Elena's press conference, Ravensholm Palace had settled into a rhythm that felt almost miraculous after months of tension and uncertainty. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the family's private breakfast room as Elena and Alexander shared their first unhurried meal together in what felt like ages. The public response to Elena's transparency had been overwhelmingly positive. Editorial boards that had been critical of her in the past published glowing pieces about her courage and integrity. Social media had exploded with support from citizens who appreciated her willingness to open her finances for scrutiny. Most importantly, the charitable organizations she supported had seen a surge in donations as people were inspired by her example. The Children's Hospital called this morning, Elena said, passing Alexander the newspaper's financial section, where a prominent article discussed the Elena effect on charitable giving. They've received more donations in the past 2 weeks than in the previous 6 months combined. Alexander smiled, noting the genuine joy in his wife's voice. And, how are you feeling about the Veterans Charity Dinner tonight? Excited, Elena replied, and meant it. For the first time since joining the royal family, she was looking forward to a public engagement without anxiety about potential criticism or sabotage. Isabella said she has some special announcement to make during the evening. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Isabella entered the breakfast room carrying a thick folder and wearing an expression of satisfaction that had become increasingly common over the past weeks. Good morning, she said, settling into the chair across from them. I have news that I think you'll both find interesting. She opened the folder and withdrew several official-looking documents. The investigation into Marcus Thornfield's media empire has revealed a pattern of criminal activity that goes far beyond what we initially suspected. Alexander leaned forward intently. What kind of pattern? It appears that Thornfield has been running a coordinated campaign against multiple public figures, using paid informants to gather private information that could be used for blackmail or public destruction, Isabella explained. Lady Victoria was just one of many people he had placed in positions of trust. Elena felt a chill run down her spine. How many people were affected? At least a dozen public figures have been targeted over the past 3 years, Isabella continued. Politicians, business leaders, and, yes, members of various royal families across Europe. The scope is staggering. Why? Alexander asked. Power and profit, Isabella said simply. Thornfield's publications thrived on scandal, but, more importantly, he was using the information for financial manipulation. Create a scandal around a business leader, short their company's stock, then profit when the value drops. Elena shook her head in disgust. So real people's lives were destroyed for stock market gains? Exactly. But here's the important part. Your decision to fight back publicly has given other victims the courage to come forward. The authorities now have enough evidence to bring serious charges against Thornfield and his entire network. Alexander reached for Elena's hand across the table. You didn't just save your own reputation. You helped bring down a criminal conspiracy. The irony, Isabella added with a slight smile, is that by targeting you, they ultimately brought about their own downfall. If they had left you alone, they might have continued operating indefinitely. Elena was quiet for a moment, processing the magnitude of what Isabella was telling her. What happens now? Now, we move forward, Isabella said firmly. Which brings me to tonight's announcement. She withdrew one final document from the folder, this one bearing the official seal of the royal family. I'm formally expanding your role within the Royal Foundation. You'll be taking over as the primary coordinator for all charitable activities, with full authority to establish new programs and partnerships. Elena stared at the document, hardly believing what she was reading. Isabella, are you sure? This is an enormous responsibility. It's a responsibility you've already proven yourself capable of handling, Isabella replied. Your approach to charitable work, the personal connections, the financial transparency, the innovative partnerships, it's exactly what we need. Alexander squeezed Elena's hand. You've been doing this work already. Now you'll just have the official authority to do it properly. There's one condition, Isabella added with a mischievous glint in her eye. You have to promise to keep being exactly who you are. No more trying to fit into some preconceived notion of how a royal should behave. Elena felt tears well up in her eyes. I promise. Good. Because tonight, when I make this announcement, I want the whole kingdom to see the woman who was brave enough to stand up for herself and, in doing so, protected countless others. As Isabella gathered her documents and prepared to leave, she paused at the door. Elena, there's something else I want you to know. In 40 years of royal service, I have never been prouder of a family member than I was watching you at that press conference. You showed courage, integrity, and grace under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. After Isabella left, Elena and Alexander sat in comfortable silence, both processing the magnitude of the changes in their lives. Finally, Alexander spoke. Do you remember what you said to me on our wedding day, when you were nervous about becoming part of the royal family? Elena smiled at the memory. I said I hoped I could make a difference. You have, he said simply. Not just for our family, but for everyone who was being victimized by people like Thornfield and Lady Victoria. You've proven that transparency and courage can triumph over manipulation and lies. It wasn't just me, Elena protested. You fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself. Isabella chose to listen and change her mind. James and Margaret and Sarah all stood by me when it would have been easier to distance themselves. That's true, Alexander agreed. But you were the one who decided to stop hiding and start fighting back. That decision changed everything. That evening, as Elena and Alexander prepared for the Veterans Charity Dinner, Elena caught sight of herself in the full-length mirror in their dressing room. The woman looking back at her wore the same face, but everything else had changed. Gone was the uncertain, anxious expression that had marked her features for months. In its place was a calm confidence that came from knowing exactly who she was and what she stood for. The sapphire bracelet caught the light as she adjusted her gown, and Elena thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been drowning in criticism and self-doubt. Tonight, she would stand before the kingdom as a senior member of the royal family, officially recognized for her contributions and trusted with greater responsibility. Ready? Alexander asked, offering her his arm. Ready, Elena replied, and meant it completely. As they made their way to the ballroom where hundreds of guests awaited, Elena reflected on the lessons of the past months. She had learned that kindness without strength could be exploited, but she had also learned that strength without kindness was hollow. She had discovered that transparency, while sometimes painful, was ultimately liberating. Most importantly, she had learned that the support of people who truly knew her was worth more than the approval of those who only knew her reputation. The ballroom doors opened, and Elena stepped forward into her new role with confidence and grace, ready to serve the crown and the kingdom in her own unique way. Behind her, the shadows of doubt and deception that had plagued the palace for months had finally been banished by the light of truth and the power of standing up for what was right. The future stretched before them, full of challenges and opportunities, but Elena knew that whatever came next, she would face it as herself, completely, authentically, and without apology. The crown had found not just a dutiful princess, but a true leader, and the kingdom was better for it.